Lessons from a Sheepdog. Lesson 5. The Test of Faithfulness. During our working years together, several problem areas began to appear in Lass's behavior. In a strange way, one of her greatest strengths became her greatest weakness. It was the matter of wanting me in view at all times. Lass had a passionate fixation on being with me and in action beside me. This intense loyalty contributed enormously to her prompt obedience and enabled her to react to my hand signals so well. So it can be understood why the one command which she found most difficult to carry out was stay. This explicit word meant for her to remain steady wherever she was placed. On a sheep ranch, part of the success with sheep involves moving them continuously from pasture to pasture. It also means intensive management of the flock and sorting out ewes, lambs, and rams. Only with the eager assistance of a good sheepdog can these operations be carried out efficiently and without undue disturbance for the sheep. At such times it might meant I might ask her to guard an open gate, or she might be expected to hold a small band of ewes in a corner while I checked their lambs, or it might be any one of a dozen other little tasks that demanded her to be steadfast, alert, and on guard while I was busy about other duties. Lass often felt she was missing out on the action in these situations. If I disappeared from her view, she was sure she had been forgotten. She would become uneasy, begin to move about, then take off in search of me. When I came back to find her gone, it was always a severe disappointment. The sheep would quickly scatter, our work would be undone, and the task would have to be started all over again. Lass, of course, would not fully comprehend the complexity of the work we were doing, and at times she gave me the distinct impression that for a dog as energetic as she was, to stay was almost asking too much of her. God used this element in Lass to teach me a most important principle. I began to grasp the absolute necessity to be quietly steadfast and faithful wherever He placed me. In a sense, these interludes in life were a test not only of my faithfulness to God, but also of His to me. Such times of apparent inaction are not necessarily a trial for the lethargic or easygoing individual, but the person eager to be in the thick of things, who is keen for evidence of the Master at work. These are tough and testing times. We may feel we are forgotten by God. In retrospect, I realize that even during those years at Fairwinds, I sometimes felt that way toward Christ. I often wondered why I should be stuck with this flock of sheep. I wondered why the Lord did not allow me to get into greater action in other areas of life. It was hard to see that then that I was learning to be steadfast just where He put me. At such times we do not have the greater view of the Good Shepherd. We do not see His hand at work. We are sorely tempted to break faith, to make the next move all on our own. It has often been said that almost any of us can be heroic. even whoa, there's a weird bug flying around me. It has often been said that almost any of us can be heroic, even daring in the midst of great excitement. But it takes a much more steadfast faith in our Father to stay true in the quiet place where He puts us. It is in the daily duties of our little lives where God asks us to be loyal, steady friends, people who will perform their part without fanfare, those who can be trusted implicitly to do their duty. And for reflecting on those days with Lass, I am still stirred by memories of times when she proved so true to me. I can recall vividly how thrilled I was to find she had stuck to her post and played her part well. how I would pat and praise her, and how she reveled in my adulation. It is exactly the same for us. Christ will again make his presence apparent to us. He need not be grieved or disappointed. He can be given the great joy. He can be given the great joy of finding us faithful in the place he puts us. His measurement of our success does not lie in our spectacular activities. It lies in our quiet steadfastness for him. He does not expect us to fully understand his management of our lives, but he does ask us to stay true to him today. Just a little interlude here while I drink from my Yeti. And there's pups. Okay. It tasted good. I got ice in there, and that ice will stay in there forever. Nice and cool. It was at this point in her performance that Lass was exposed to the most severe temptations. Of these, by far, the most tormenting was a flock of crows that nested on a nearby island. The noisy black rascals had chosen to establish a regular rookery in the trees that clung to the rock crop offshore. There, in the tangle of tough branches, they built their nest, laid their eggs, and reared their fledglings. In the usual manner of these crafty birds, they were alert to any danger. They regarded Lass and me as intruders in their territory, and they seemed to find some fiendish pleasure in tormenting us with their raucous cries and daring dives. For the dog, they became a formidable temptation in distracting her from her duties. The noisy birds would come streaming out of their trees to swoop low over Lass with jeering caws and tormenting tactics. They would skim down just above her head like dive bombers swooping to the attack. Ooh, picture. Wasn't enough that he painted a really good picture of that in your mind's eye. There's a pretty good drawing. The distraction was so strong that Lass would tear away from them, leaping, barking, racing over the fields in wild abandon. Her muscled frame seemed almost to float above the fields as she swept after the crows in full flight. At times I had the clear impression that the crows engaged in this game with devilish glee, and when it was all over, Lass would come back, spent and exhausted, her tongue hanging out with weariness. In one sense, it all seemed very amusing. In fact, she would look up into my face, her head cocked to one side as if to say, "What great sport that was. I really put them to flight." Actually, in another dimension, it was a serious obstacle to the efficient operation of the ranch. For what the crows did was to distract the dog from her paramount duties. Their silly games wore her out and exhausted her energies for useful service. Perhaps the most disagreeable part was that the mischievous birds caused Lass to break faith and tear off after them when she was supposed to stay. I often thought about the crows and how they managed to intrude themselves into my management of the ranch. They flew in from outside the property. They were in no way a part of it. Yet their appearances every spring, when they returned from their winter migration to the south, were a signal that they had put up with their nuisance, that we had to put up with their nuisance behavior all summer. In the contest with the belligerent birds, I saw clearly a parallel that we face in our service for God. We are often distracted from the Master's highest intentions for us by extenuating events in our lives. Circumstances which are not part of his purposes for us intrude themselves into our experience. At first appearance, they may seem harmless, even somewhat entertaining. The difficulty is they distract us from our most important responsibilities to Christ. They call us away and tempt us to take off in hot pursuit. In the process, our energies are wasted, our strength is expended, yet the benefit either to God or his flock is nil. It may all appear as a very spectacular show. It might even seem to us a legitimate part of our service. Still, it really is not anything more than a show. Without being unduly critical, it is essential for each of us to examine our lives and ascertain what diverts us from the highest duties to which God calls us as his co-workers. Within the community of our churches, it is often the temptation to entertain rather than to edify God's people. It is a desire to amuse audiences rather than instruct them in God's word. The temptations come in many guises, but like the crows, though they are all shining in their bright plumage, they were black rascals bent on mischief. It seemed a fascinating irony at Fairwinds that in the autumn, about the time the crows flocked up for the fall migration, we began our land clearing operations. With summer work over and the arrival of the gentle autumn rains, it was time to start tearing out underbrush and unwanted trees to provide new pasture for the flock. Instead of crows to chase, Lass now turned her attention to the blazing sparks that would be carried into the wind from the roaring fires. As the glowing cinders drifted across the sky, she would go racing and leaping after them, barking ferociously. Often in the midst of my work, I would stop and watch the remarkable performance she put on. She would leap into midair, snapping excitedly at the burning fragments borne aloft on the rising heat waves. Occasionally sparks would settle into her shining coat. There they would begin to smolder, then char her hair. It gave off a repulsive stench that drifted with the cool winter winds. In further excitement, Lass would roll in the damp grass and snap furiously at the offending sparks that had set her afire. It was all very spectacular, but in reality it did not help the work on the ranch. It wore her out completely. And during those times of testing, when she was expected to stay steadfast, it often took a single spark to undo all of our work. Of course, these episodes in which Lass let me down came as a keen disappointment. She sensed that she had not been faithful. Our own land-clearing fires had been her undoing. The same principle holds true within the church, within any community of Christians, perhaps, but perhaps most importantly within our own private relationship to Christ himself. There is the tendency to be taken up with that which is highly emotional. People are always fascinated by excitement and ecstasy in any form. The long historical record of God's dealings with his people is shot through with instances where false fire and strange sacrifices led to disaster and disillusionment. Often it has its origin within the church itself. That which was intended by God to serve his own greater purposes for our good becomes a diversion to us that nullifies our usefulness. It is worthy of consideration today that in our society, many of the most flamboyant believers often lack credibility. In their flaming zeal and inordinate preoccupation with dramatic displays, there often is intermingled irresponsible sensuality that leads them astray. There is a tendency in the church to be carried away with peripheral issues that take God's servants off on tangents. Too often the emphasis is on the dramatic rather than on the divine will of our God. In working with Lass, this lesson came home to me and again. It is not the spectacular nor the sensational, for which the Master looks. He seeks instead for me to simply be faithful wherever he places me in his all-wise plans and purposes. Bye, I love you.